Hey guys, so have you ever thought about going to Mars? At the International Congress in 2017, Elon Musk said, "You want to wake up in the morning and think the future is going to be great. That's what being a spacefaring civilization is all about. It's about believing in the future and thinking that the future will be better than the past." And I can't think of anything more exciting than going out there and being among the stars. So, while I don't claim to be an expert about spacefaring or space exploration and discovery, that's what this topic is going to be about. And to build some credibility, what I've done is I've watched and read some books. One of the books I've read, or a couple of the books I've read by Neil deGrasse Tyson are uh, Death by a Black Hole and Astrophysics for People in a Hurry, and then some. And I've just watched some TV shows and movies related to it, like Interstellar, The Martian, and Cosmos, which was also hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So you might ask, why is this relevant to me? It has nothing to do with me. So we're currently in a new transitionary period for space exploration and discovery. So I think with the current projections or attempts to possibly have a Mars settlement by 2050, it is relevant to you because you could be one of the people that gets to that you choose to be go to Mars, or that you would possibly be selected to go to Mars and accept or decline that whether you wanted to or not, because jobs are going to be needed more than just astronauts. Astronauts can't run an entire society by themselves. They need um, just jobs in general that we around here on Earth would be the same thing on Mars. So space exploration and discovery will be driven by private companies, and I'll show you that by explaining that NASA can't bear the financial burden that it once did. That just private companies are more set up to take on the challenge, and that some companies like SpaceX are making big leaps towards space exploration and discovery to start. So let's get started. NASA cannot bear the financial burden that it once did. According to NASA's previous year budget, uh, the NASA's budget was highest in 1966 at 4.41%. And to put that in perspective, it's $5.9 billion then, but adjusted now, it is $49.5 billion. Last year, or the last year that was recorded for NASA, was 2020, which was 0.48% of the federal budget, equating to $22.6 billion. So that's showed in 60 years, it's nearly halved, which means that NASA's budget is going down according to inflation. So we were bound to see a decrease from the space race, but even since 1992, where where NASA's budget made up 1.01% of the financial of the federal budget, now in 2020, or well, in 2020, the previous year recorded, it only makes up 0.48%, which just shows the inflation, or shows that it's not accommodating for inflation. So consequently, NASA's steady budget decline has stunted their growth. And while we didn't expect to see NASA at its space race time during the 1960s, when we're competing with the USSR or the Soviet Union, being the first to send a man to space and being the first to send a man to Mars, or not to Mars, but to the moon, um, there was just no way that we were going to keep up with that, because there's just not any competition for NASA anymore. NASA hasn't really had competition since the end of the Cold War, and there just wasn't any, like, we had prospective missions towards satellites going past Mars and going to other planets, but other than that, they haven't had any major missions that have been manned missions since the moon landing. So, in contrast to the problems that arise in government budgets, in space exploration and discovery, private companies can risk what they want, whereas the federal government budget spending is limited to what they get, and they won't go above and beyond that because they can't. Private companies can do that, and I mean that can be one of their pitfalls is they can go under because of their spending. But so private companies renew the sense of competition and have worked with NASA, leading to a more competitive environment and more innovation in the space. So, like I've said before, NASA isn't going to just not exist anymore. NASA is working in tandem with companies like SpaceX right now, and it's important that they do because NASA has been there and done that, and we want NASA. We need NASA. Their astronauts are impeccable at what they do, and they've done a great job so far. So why would we not want NASA? Um, but some of the vast number of companies that are represented in the private company sector of space are SpaceX, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Blue Origin, and there's hundreds of other companies um, that have begun developmental stages on spacecraft, whether that be vehicles, satellites, or just space equipment in general, whatever is needed. So the difference in private company taxation versus government taxation is government taxation is dependent on taxation by the general working class. So they tax and then that can determine the part of the government budget. Whereas the private companies would also pay for this themselves because they're taxed differently than what we are taxed for. We're not taxed for them, but they're taxed for themselves. So additionally, we will look towards the future benefits of private companies playing major roles in space travel. So while there should be a heavy reliance on private companies responsible for space travel and discovery taking over most space missions, while we don't want private companies taking over every space mission because NASA still is a major factor and deserves its rightful place. One of the planned missions is a SpaceX manned mission to Mars by 2030, and another one is Astrobotic, selected by NASA. They're going for commercial lunar payload services, which is like the Air Force with carrier planes carrying things, except it would be carrying stuff from Earth to the moon, transporting equipment there, which is what NASA has designated that company for. And they plan to have a mission to the moon in 2 years. So there's also potential plans by SpaceX to set up a society on Mars by 2050. But the potential pitfalls that these private companies run into, is just that they don't have the finances necessary to complete their lofty goals, or there isn't enough progression towards whether it be innovation or technology to land on Mars, whereas there's already that for landing on the moon, with NASA already doing it almost 60 years ago. So, likewise, NASA has a manned mission for Mars proposed for the late 2030s and 40s or 40s. So, in conclusion, I summarized some of the major 5 points as why private companies need to be pivotal. And to go over some of those again would be that NASA just cannot bear the financial burden that it once did just because due to its federal budget. And so what we want to take away is that space exploration and discovery should be driven by private companies. NASA needs to still be a major part, but private companies are not restricted to the federal budget and therefore can go deeper into their own pockets at their own expense. So what we need to think about is we need to think about the potential jobs that could be, whether it be on Mars or it be on the moon. There's just potential jobs that are outside of astronauts. Um, So the one thing I'd like to leave you with is Neil Armstrong's quote from July 20th, 1969, which was, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." So what this represents is Mars would be the next giant leap for mankind, but, or humankind, but what would be the thing that we would say about Mars? So the privatized space needs to be considered heavily to reach the heights that we once were during the space race. And once again, it promotes becoming competitive with new tech and innovation. We are in the ages of a new space age. Thank you very much.